by looking in detail at that key dilemma when it comes to working out a customs arrangement. Should we hug the EU close or break out on our own? So we've lined up two politicians from either side of the argument, and for a change, they'll be asking the questions, not me. So I'm joined by the soon-to-be former Conservative MEP and leading figure in the Leave campaign, Daniel Hannan, and by the former Labour frontbencher and supporter of Open Britain, Seema Malhotra. A little earlier this morning, we tossed a coin to see who would start. Daniel Hannan won, and he agreed that he would go first. So here he is with his thoughts on what our end relationship should be.
90% of the world's economic growth over the next 15 years will come from outside the European Union. Britain is a maritime nation, linked to the world's fastest growing economies by language and law, culture and kinship. But we can't sign trade deals with them. Not while we're in the EU's customs union. Staying in the customs union after we leave would be the worst of all worlds. It would give Brussels 100% control of our trade policy with 0% input from us. In order to take advantage of Brexit, we need to set our own regulations. Sometimes, for reasons of economies of scale, we might want to match what the EU is doing. If we do want to keep elements of the single market, though, it must be through agreement and on a case-by-case basis. In 1980, the states now in the European Union accounted for 30% of the world's GDP. Today, that figure is 15% and falling. Britain needs to raise its eyes. Our future's bright. Our future's global.
Well, Seema and Dan are both with me now. And just to explain the rules, Seema has 5 minutes to interrogate Dan. She can only ask questions, and Dan can only give answers. He can't ask questions back. So, Seema, your 5 minutes starts now.
Dan, it's just over a year until we leave the European Union. And this week, a Tory MP said, I think there's a real concern now about the direction of travel when it comes to Brexit. We're at a real crunch point and the government hasn't worked out, 19 months on, what the end game is. And we need to know. That's pretty clear, isn't it? And you and others said that Brexit was going to be easy. So why is this the case?
Well, nothing worth doing is ever easy. It's worth doing, and in a few years' time we'll look back and wonder why it took us so long. But I don't accept that the government hasn't made its position clear. The government made its position clear first in Theresa May's Lancaster House speech, then in a series of white papers or position papers that have been produced since. We want to have, as she keeps saying, control of our laws, of our taxes, of our borders. But within that, we want to have the closest possible relationship with the rest of the EU, compatible with being a sovereign country. We want to be its best friend and closest ally. And that will mean that in some areas we do align with the EU as a friend and ally, but it means that we'll do so on our own terms.
But things aren't going according to plan, are they? And you and others said that we would be keeping key agencies. David Davis said that we would keep agencies. Then he said that he hoped we'd keep them. And now they're leaving. The European Medicines Agency is heading for Amsterdam. The European Banking Agency will go to Paris. That's 2,000 highly skilled jobs being lost from the capital. Isn't this a high price that we're paying for this uncertainty?
If you're that fixated on 2,000 Eurocrats' jobs and you've nothing to say about the 500,000 jobs that have been created over the same period, then I think, Seema, there's something wrong with your sense of priorities. All of the predictions we had about job losses during the referendum campaign turned out to be nonsense. Instead of losing 500,000, we've gained 500,000. Since then, more people are working than ever before. And no, I never claimed that we'd be keeping these Euro agencies in the UK. Of course, if you leave the EU, you leave these regulatory agencies and you no longer have them on your soil. And the flip side of that is that we're in a position to make our own regulations to suit our own conditions and needs.
You are calling these agencies Eurocrats. These are people who are helping us with key parts of our economy, key sectors that are important for our economy as a whole, scientists, those who are experts in finance and other sectors. Now, I agree that Britain could trade more with the world, and we need to. But the evidence from leaks from the government this week show the impact of free trade deals around the world will in no way compensate for the loss of trade with the EU, which a hard Brexit would do to the UK. Now, if you don't believe me, you can listen to the words of the Prime Minister, who said during the referendum, we export more to Ireland than we do to China, twice as much to Belgium as we do to India. It is not realistic to think we could just replace European trade with these new markets. Now,
we export more to Ireland than to the whole of China. That is our problem. That is precisely our problem. Which of those two is the better long-term growth prospect?
Don't you agree that there is going to be an impact on British businesses and families? even for the short term? And isn't it important that you raise that risk and share that risk with the British people?
Obviously, what we want is to have free and frictionless trade with the EU and the freedom to make trade deals further afield. The EU doesn't have any trade deal in place with the US, which is the world's largest economy, with China, which is its second largest, with fast-growing economies like India, with old friends like Australia. The idea that we can't do better as a free trading maritime country, making our own trade deals and bringing benefits to people in this country, I just think is incredibly defeatist. And are we really saying that it's a good future for us to be selling more to Ireland with 5 million people than to China with more than 1 billion? I mean, that seems to me quite an unambitious vision of our future.
Study after study, Dan, and you will know this when you do your research, that shows that the proximity that we have to nations goes a long way to determining our economic links. That's the case not just for us, but for countries around the world. Now, of course, we could do more. We actually have a trade surplus with the United States of America already. And in fact, the government had an export strategy. I've argued for more to be done. I've talked to people, investors from other countries, who have said that they want to come and do more in the UK. But the point is that part of the reason they do that is because we've got access, and they have access, to the European market of 500 million people in order to sell those goods too. What do you say to the genuine concerns from Nissan, from Honda, now even the Japanese ambassador, talking about a challenge to the profitability of those companies in the UK and the threat that they may have to leave those operations and go elsewhere?
Well, they made those threats during the referendum, and after the vote was in, when they knew we were leaving, they confirmed that they were not only staying here, but that Nissan was substantially increasing its productivity and its activity in the UK. So I think you should look at what they're doing rather than what they're now saying. But this idea that we are defined by our geography is a very old-fashioned kind of 19th or 18th century way of looking at trade. In the modern age, when we have very low freight costs, we have the internet, we have cheap flights, geographical proximity has never mattered less, and we are linked by language and law, by culture, by legal systems, accountancy systems, to the fastest growing economies in the planet. That's where we need to be.
Time's up, I'm afraid. You've had your 5 minutes. We have to be strict with the rules. I want to nip in though and ask you, Dan, I mean, you've set out your vision for how you would like to see our future relationship with the EU. How confident are you that the Prime Minister is going to outline a clear vision soon and that it will align with yours?
Well, she's outlined the broad principles already, and then they were given quite... They have been fleshed out on issues like how to make the Irish border work, how to make the facilitation of customs work. I mean, this thing that nobody has explained what we can do in terms of customs isn't true. The government produced a quite lengthy paper talking about how we can do things like expand the Common Transit Convention, authorise more local economic operators. It's worth noting that both the head of HMRC here and his equivalent in the Republic of Ireland have said that there is no need for a customs border, that companies can make their customs declarations in the way that they make their tax declarations. So I'm just struck by all the people who said listen to the experts during the campaign, now emphatically choosing not to listen to the experts when they say that they don't need a hard border in Ireland.
OK, Dan, thanks for that. Now it's the turn of Seema to be grilled, but first, here's her thoughts on how our future relationship with the EU should look.
I respect the result of the referendum, and now the task is to move forward in a way that addresses the reasons people voted to leave and protects jobs and the economy. 43% of all of our trade is done with the European Union. Staying inside the customs union gives us tariff-free trade access to our main EU partners. Issues surrounding immigration and sovereignty can be addressed while staying in the customs union and the single market, but on terms that we negotiate. We can also then trade freely with countries the EU has deals with, deals that we have helped negotiate. And staying in the customs union is key to a solution on Ireland. Our select committee found that it is not clear how we can avoid a hard border if we leave the customs union. I agree we need reform and greater controls on the freedom of movement, but people didn't vote to become poorer. So let's leave the European Union in a way that puts the prosperity of families and businesses first.
So, as before, Dan, you now have 5 minutes to question Seema.
Seema, 2 weeks ago, Jeremy Corbyn said that he was against staying in the customs union because, quote, it's protectionist against developing countries. Do you agree?
I think it's important to balance what we do need to see change in terms of international trade and support for developing countries, but also to recognise the contribution that being in the customs union and the European Union has made for our prosperity, for businesses
is that a yes or a no
and families.
Do you agree with Jeremy Corbyn?
I think there's a lot that's been done to support development, support international development. I have laid out my view.
Sorry, forgive me, that's a different question, Seema. We're not talking about international trade. Do you agree that the customs union is protectionist against developing countries?
A customs union can be protectionist for those countries that are in the customs union. I think that is very understood economics, and what it does is it encourages trade creation and development between those countries. But it doesn't preclude, as has been shown by the over 60 trade agreements that we have as a European Union with countries around the world, from having strong relationships with other countries.
So one of the things where we are obliged by the customs union to impose tariffs, there's lots of things that we don't produce ourselves. For example, we have to impose tariffs on oranges. Now, in your constituency and in mine, there are not very many commercial orange plantations. Do you think it's a reasonable thing that to protect Mediterranean orange growers, we should be discriminating against producers in Africa, in the Americas, in developing countries, at a cost to our own consumers?
Well, I believe what you can do is negotiate across the world in terms of how you encourage greater free trade and greater ways in which we can trade with different nations. And that's what we also do already. And we've had an enormous track record of investing and supporting farmers in Africa.
On that point, you're saying that we're going to leave the EU but stay in the customs union. How will we have any influence? That means that we're giving Brussels total control over what our trade policy is, but we're no longer EU members, so we have no input ourselves.
Almost 50% of our trade is with the European Union. Over 70% of the companies that export to the European Union, over 70% of companies that export to the European Union, that's jobs that your constituents and my constituents will be dependent on. Over 90% of that being small and medium-sized enterprises. They look to the relationship that we have.
I'm not having much joy getting answers to the questions. Let me have another go here, because you're going off on a tangent.
I'm not going off on a tangent.
Let me have another go.
What I am saying is we can do both, and that is what we should be doing.
So we can do. So you think that leaving the EU but staying in the customs union, so that Brussels controls 100% of our trade, but we have zero input because we're no longer. You think that somehow gives us more influence in world trade than taking our own voice and our own vote in the World Trade Organization and being able to do our own deals? Is that what you're saying?
You know what is interesting is when you talk about the WTO and WTO rules, Dan, if you look at the government's own analysis, which was an average of other studies, it shows that even in the southeast, if there is a withdrawal based on
I'm going to have one more
Brexit,
go trying to get an answer here, Seema, because you're telling me lots and lots of interesting things that are not what I'm asking.
And 16% of the northeast, this country will be poorer.
The highest tariffs imposed by the common external tariff, the customs union, are on the items that most negatively impact people on low incomes, particularly food, clothing and footwear. People on low incomes pay a proportionately higher chunk of their weekly budgets on these commodities, these basic things. They're the most badly hit. So we are clobbering poor people in this country in order to hurt developing nations. How can you, as a progressive politician with a proud history of standing up for people who are underprivileged, now stand there and defend a system that forces us to give more to wealthy French farmers than to poor African farmers, and that forces the highest bills to be paid by the lowest income people in Britain?
Well, I'm going to fundamentally disagree with you, and that won't surprise you, because I do believe that being a member of the European Union has been fundamental for our prosperity, for families and businesses. And what you fail to highlight are numerous studies that show that British families are already hundreds of pounds worse off as a result of us having had the referendum and now the uncertainty that has followed. People have already suffered. You will know this. That's still not an answer. You will know this.
That's still
with
not
higher prices and wages that have not gone. And it is Conservative MPs that have raised this in the House of Commons. Dan, you should have a look.
The countries that are closest to the EU economically, the countries that have opted to parallel or join the single market, the EFTA countries, Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, none of them is remotely interested in joining the customs union. Why do you think that is?
they have separate arrangements. They have arrangements with each other, but they also have ways in which they resolved disputes. And it's like a mini European Union in the way that they work together. Now, I believe that we could consider being and approaching the EEA EFTA countries to see whether that would be an arrangement that could work for Britain, potentially
leaving the
alongside
customs union, right?
some of the potentially alongside how we negotiate being in the customs union. Fundamental for peace in Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement. It's not just me saying that, it's the Irish government, it's the head of the Irish police, and it's the Irish people.
We'll need to leave it there because time is up. Thank you very much, Dan, for the questions. What you're advocating, Seema, is not Labour Party policy staying in the customs union. Do you believe you'll change Jeremy Corbyn's mind about this and get him to agree with you?
Well, I believe there is a debate. You know there's a debate going on in the Labour Party, and that is not to be, not unexpected, because as the situation changes, as new facts come to light, as we have to consider what life is going to be like with the end state post the transition, we will have that debate. Now, it's certainly the case that the range of views across the Labour Party are far less in terms of the spectrum than what's going on in the Conservative Party. And the fundamental issue is that we have a Prime Minister and a Cabinet that absolutely have no idea about an end state. They fail to reach any sort of agreement after 2 days of an away this week. And I think it is embarrassing for us as a nation that 19 months on after the referendum, we are in such disarray.
OK, well, Seema, Dan, thank you both very much for coming in and asking the questions. And for those of you in the south of England, you'll be lucky enough to see more of Dan Hannan as he'll be appearing in the Sunday Politics South in just over 10 minutes.